some time my internet fails, so then I have to go onto my hotspot on my phone. So
Not
because
the issue. So,
the load shedding has been longer. Yes.
so yeah, the just to pick up from the last question before I lost you, when you speak to government and business and them on this topic of a tiger model or what the apartheid regime did right in terms of development, what is their response?
Well, I mean, as I said, we actualized what we thought is the possibility into the future in the Indlamete scenarios, which were scenarios that were constructed outside government. I mean, government had two scenarios only ever since, and then abandoned the scenarios. And under Zuma, there were no scenarios at all. Of course, he had the National Development Plan, which was a 360-page document that was agreed upon. The critique of President Beju was that this is not a plan, and indeed it is not. I mean, you don't have a plan that doesn't have a quantified path towards its realization. So we got these scenarios, and I insisted that we have to quantify the scenarios, which we did. And then we converged and presented this to government, presented them to everyone in the country. They were so happy, private sector in particular. The question was always, what does the government say? You present and then they say, what does government say?
Yeah.
Now, of course, the president also asked, what does the government say? President Beg. And we said, well, he said, well, if you haven't convinced them, then you haven't started. And that's where we are sitting, where we are not able to convince them.
So they being stubborn, or are they dogmatic, or what is the blockage? Is it interests?
We think that people are knowledgeable, and knowledgeable people listen and change their mind. So, in the light of information, at least they can say, let's try. You see, there's been the Chicago School, Milton Friedman's market fundamentalism, that has influenced South Africa. And that influence is in the Treasury. And the Treasury became virtually the center of government, and not the presidency.
Yeah.
By that fact, therefore, turning the presidency into, whatever the Treasury says will go. And when you don't have a good system of planning, of design, then the Treasury becomes the de facto president. And it is entrenched in the Chicago School of Milton Friedman's market fundamentalism. I mean, I was just reading the chapter 4 report of IMF. I've just written about it. That they have had a stranglehold on South Africa for the last 30 years. And it was only between 2002 and 2008 that South Africa managed to actually grow at a higher pace, reduce unemployment, reduce poverty significantly. And while South Africa, between 1996, when it adopted GEAR, it said it will have its own structural reform program and not financed by the IMF. But nonetheless, austerity measures. But when it removed those austerity measures in 2002 to 2008, it showed what is possible. Many want to argue that it was the minerals boom and the World Cup. Fair enough. But if the changes were not made in policy, because that World Cup was state-led, the investments were state-led, and then private sector followed.
Yeah.
It proved that when things are state-led, matters of fate such as boom of minerals and so on actually speed up the things that can be achieved. To the
But
extent that that stranglehold of austerity continues, they're not going to move. So that's where the seat of power is. And that's the resistance we are facing against heterodox ways of doing things.
but
So,
they can be a compromise position, and they're not thinking. You see, they're thinking dogmatically. There's
well,
compromise
that's
positions, and the obvious one is this: the Chinese come with development money, and they
uh,
bring things. So it's not our pension money. That's state-led development, just another state's money, okay? But it's state development. When Eskom is now
that's
said
where
to
this
have
thing looks.
competition, it's EDF, it's Electricité France that's tendering. That's state-led money, So what are they talking about?
This is where the stupidity comes. If you cannot put your own money, like pensions, into development and trust that you can go and borrow from somebody else, that someone else must be stupid to think that you'll do well with their own money, that which you cannot do with your own. And that's where the thinking in the treasury is skewed, because ESCOM, when the rebuild was started, we should have just borrowed from, or rather drawn from, the pensions and deal with ESCOM at nominal rates of return, at a bond that is probably 30 or so years to maturity, or 40 years, which would have been much, much, much cheaper than now having burdened ESCOM with a debt that was supposed to be paid through user pay for users that do not have employment. And then you squeeze them and say, no, no, they should pay. This is bad behavior by South Africans. When you make the exception of individual behaviors that want to cheat and make that the rule, then you run into problems, because the expectation was that people will pay. But when the majority of the people don't have the wherewithal, with what will they pay?
Yeah,
So
they can't.
it is this energy systems failing to understand the momentum of the energy systems that actually direct things properly. So if the energy
But the
system
other
that we
other issue in here which comes in is organizations like NERSA. How can any businessman survive if he has to compete at a rate to which he cannot recover his costs? Are we surprised the wheels are falling off the bus at Eskom when they're forced to sell at a loss? If you're selling at a loss, why do they have debt? That's why the state has to give them debt. I mean, this is my mother was a small business owner. She would die next month if she cannot make a profit, if she cannot break even.
yes,
How do we
absolutely.
expect? It's impossible. So the whole institution of NERSA must be abandoned.
I mean, the whole thing is just stupid, completely stupid. That you can squeeze blood out of stone. You see, the IMF prescripts talk about structural reforms. And these structural reforms have been things that have been talked about all the time. I mean, let's just take the example of 1996 gear to 2000, where South Africa was obedient to IMF's prescripts, except not borrowing from the IMF. At the end of that period, unemployment was very high, growth was very low, and the promise was there will be inclusive growth. Today, the IMF is bringing the same nonsense, saying that structural reforms so that growth can be. And you look at the Reserve Bank, it has just adopted something called sentiment as part of the measure of how it sets interest rates. Now, that whole thing of sentiment has just contaminated what they think about. I mean, what is sentiment? Yes, market sentiment. So they are trying to separate setting of interest rates from the monetary policy, which is the right thing to do. But instead of actually saying, now we will use these monetary policy tools to influence the fiscus, they have invested into something called sentiment in there, which is bringing the markets back into this equation, whereby then the prices are established by the markets and the heavy ceases to be existent, and you always shoot at the light with what is light. So
Yeah.
prices just spiral out of order and people have to suffer. So ESCOM has to be divided so that we can get efficiencies out of ESCOM. Whatever efficiencies you are looking at, they will just give you a minimum relief. I mean, you'll minimize corruption, you'll minimize those things. But the architecture of how ESCOM should supply cheap energy will have been destroyed completely.
But you see,
So,
here's my theory that comes into it. I've studied deeply into Russian history, and look at what the Chicago School, the Harvard guys actually did to Russia in the 1990s. It was much worse than South Africa, but it came down to systemic sabotage through policies. And what we are facing here with is a reserve bank or government's monetary policy that is actively creating systemic sabotage against the state institutions, the strategic national assets. And look, I'm not a communist or a Marxist or any of that sort, but are you telling me the French are idiotic for now renationalizing EDF, for rebuilding the nuclear
they
plants?
own a
I mean, we have railways nationalized in France. Nationalization is not a scary word, not because Malema says it. The Afrikaners had it under apartheid. You know, there's nothing
I mean,
scary about
Russia under a nationalized economy threatened the US in terms of how it sped up its growth and its development and its levels of consciousness and education. It happened under that period from Lenin 1919, 1918 to when Mikhail Gorbachev decided to go perestroika and glasnost. And it was under the influence of Milton Friedman when he got there. And that's what happened to South Africa, because when that happened, the apartheid regime opportunistically decided that this is the time to start negotiating because we can ease our way with the ANC because there's no longer strong communists or anything. So even China at the time was still in the doldrums with its style of communism. It was only that which threatened them at the time that they said we have to modernize, but our modernization and our economic policies will be informed by our own system of markets, which is the ever normal granary and shooting with that which is heavy to the light. So that's what China has continued to do. Russia,
my view has
literacy
been that,
levels.
sorry, my view has been it's a very simple model: state-driven heavy industry, okay, but the market distributes the goods because let's face it, the government cannot make small judgments. So you have a compromise,
Oh,
which
no,
is
it can't.
the profit.
It can't. It can't.
Yeah.
It can't. I mean, you remember that it was under Mao Zedong, or was it? Yes, I think it was. It happened under Mao Zedong that the collectivization of production of crops, the innovations that had to be set, were set by some 3 people, and they were asked how they did it, and they were scared to say how they did it. But once the Chinese understood that model, they said, no, we need this market kind of economy. We need to allow a certain portion of their produce to be distributed whichever way they want to distribute, for as long as they meet the food security that China requires. So there has to be a market economy. But if you fundamentally shift the market economy into the fundamentals of such things as energy, education, and so on, then we have destroyed that country. Because
Well, the logic of this is very simple. The Chicago School was funded by oligarchs in America. It's a private university. Yeah? It's a Rockefeller institution, but it's just not Rockefeller. It's just a name that always gets you discredited. It's lots of private capital funding and ideology that serves the interest. Okay. The other thing is, there's a very good book that was written by a man by the name of Matt Stoller called The 100-Year War Between Monopoly and Democracy. And all we are faced with here is monopolistic practices. Okay. How was monopoly defeated in the end of the last century in the United States? There was a good lawyer like Louis Brandeis who came in and he just nailed guys for stealing money, He locked them up in jail. He broke up the big banks and the railways, and that led to the union movement in America that formed the New Deal, which was the largest expansion of the middle class in human history, I believe. It's faster than China even. So there's always when it comes to infrastructure, which you say, when it comes to education, when it comes to things of that nature, the capacity of the state is better at dealing with those questions. It's just, and it's how all European social democracies work. It's not a taboo communist idea, you know.
Yeah. Oh yes, I mean, yet we actually think that we can nibble on the margins on these things, and we have actually broken and destroyed that infrastructure. I mean, when the NHI, I mean, the South Africa has now passed the NHI Act, or rather, it's the bill. It's now passed, and I think it will be. I think there is already contestation to it. While the NHI is a good idea, but the way it's implemented, so the political opportunism that is coming through, it's quite devastating. That this NHI, good as it is as an idea, was destroyed in a decade ago when Motsoaledi started bringing public health officials to implement public health workers. And now, when COVID hit, we didn't have public health workers. Now, an election is around the corner. So the best thing the government can do is to say, let's get public health NHI back. Where will they get the staff from? The people have not been trained because we destroyed the nursing schools, which were public institutions that could do that. So there are so many missteps in our current that if you talk about public policy, you really have to think hard, what public policy are we talking about? It's an empty shell. It's disgraceful. So we make certainly apartheid in terms of infrastructure for those things was very great. And we make apartheid super better. To the point where some people are beginning to say apartheid was, during apartheid it was better. No, it wasn't. But in terms of actually taking that kernel and using it, I mean, it's like a Marxist philosophy where he was arguing with a Hegelian philosophy that no, the Hegelian philosophy of the spirit is nonsense, but at the level of introducing dialectics, that's what we need. And that dialectics is very important, and Marx ran with the dialectics. And in similar ways, we have to say, from a planning perspective and thinking through things, apartheid was very good, and that's what we should keep, should steal.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I
Yeah.
mean, I think we need to somehow sell the idea to the population. I don't think it's that difficult because I think the ordinary people understand it. Because many of the Afrikaners have been trying to say this to the ANC since 1994, that you're on the wrong developmental path. But the cognitive dissonance come in is when they say, okay, that means nationalization. They're like, no, but that is communism.
Yeah.
You know? So that dissonance has to be broken before you can get forward.
Well, I think when you need to name it before you practice it, but you can also still practice it without giving it a label, because it is basically saying, no, we want Spionet back, we want Denel back, we want ESCOM back, we want all those things, and then we list the properties that they had. These were the properties that when you left the military, or before you go to the military, you'll have gone to ESCOM. When you leave, come back from the military, you go to ESCOM, you go to this, and then you go to the ABSA Bank, which is looking at this and that and that. And that's the model that we have to negotiate and say, look, we need that path. And that path meant you would, as a child of a pauper in 1933, you would be the head of a multinational bank in South Africa later, because of the traits that we have put in place, so that it is the general path rather than an exception. At the moment, we have just created exceptions that make people look and get hungry and jealous and think that they can achieve that when at design, it's not possible.
Well, there's another aspect in here which I think is we are starting to see already. If as I said to you earlier, ESCOM was used to solve conflicts as a grand strategy for South Africa. What happens when you privatize ESCOM and you get rid of those infrastructures? Those conflicts reassert themselves. So energy is used, and this is very important for investors. I don't understand it. Civil engineers, we don't design energy just for kilowatts to your house. Create human habitat. When you destroy it, you destroy the habitat. And why do we see the violence? Why do we see the anger in the country? Because the humans are living in a habitat that cannot support their needs. And that is where I think the logic must come in. If we put energy at the center of the developmental model, you probably end up with something similar to the apartheid regime, probably. But it will be a logical model close to the Asian tiger of South Africa, because we are at an advantage in South Africa at the moment. We have lots of young men that are my age, maybe a bit younger still. I'm in my 30s. They need work. We need infrastructure.
Yes.
It's quite obvious what work they can do. They will be prepared to do it. And then you mobilize those men who are committing violence and things of that sort into a structure of society. You help to rebuild the society. And it only has to do it for one generation before you've got a decent infrastructure and you're on the legs of where the Europeans are today. It doesn't even take that long,
No, you are correct. I mean, I was talking to Kevin Cam. He mentioned you in my discussion about this. I say, well, what do we do? I mean, this whole thing that the energy discussion is almost a marginal discussion, and is discussed as a sector instead of as the engine of everything, and how we mobilize it. So this is, I think, where we have to start. This is where we have to say, well, in as far as nuclear energy is concerned and coal energy is concerned, because I'm sure we can still extract a lot of out of coal, and it is possible to limit the emissions. I mean, carbon dioxide is good for trees anyway, but the other harmful emissions can be pulled out and channeled differently. And it's not beyond science to make that discovery. I think the world is aiming at once making sure that coal is stranded, is a stranded asset. And once it's stranded, then they can buy it for cheap. And then when the technology develops that can actually fix coal, then they come back and say, well, we have coal, and it's no longer in the hands of South Africans. And it's
Well,
outside.
the simple thing for coal is this. Our plants were built in the 1980s. I think I'm losing you again. And yeah, I said the plants was building in the 1980s. Let's just upgrade them with the best coal plants at the moment. High efficiency, thermal. When you do that, you add 20% more power on the grid just by upgrading them. Okay?
Well,
that's very simple. Then,
one of the things
then you sit with nuclear on the coast. That's it.
What we are looking at actually is by just adding cooling to them, making cooling more efficient using the Maize-Sengo cycle, which is just uses air and water, and you build this cooling systems, because you will increase their cooling capacity. Then in the meantime, you can actually pull out the condensers and the compressors, because those eat energy. And what is interesting about this M cycle is that you can cool at a constant consumption of energy, whatever degrees of heat or temperature you are cooling from. You don't need to increase thermal. You don't need to increase thermal consumption to cool. It's constant. So, for instance, when you use Maize-Sengo cycle cooling, you drop the consumption of energy by 90%. So from the demand side, you drop that by 90% for just cooling in the so the same thing the same logic will happen at ESCOM if you use the same cooling. And the pre-cooling, which is a very, very primitive, but it's something that you can do. You just build this cooling entities around the tower, and then it improves your thermal capacity. But for gas powered stations, you actually blow in condensed oxygen in there,
Yeah.
and then make the combustion more efficient. So we can use our coal forever.
Yeah, but I mean,
But
what self-respecting nation would give up its energy security? That's what's being asked of us. I mean,
well, I mean,
it's insane.
I mean, the president has just made a U-turn. My Sunday column now, he actually looks at all those, from the behavior of conduct of South African Revenue, South African Reserve Bank, to what the president U-turn is about. Can we review our model of just energy transition, to the RPF that has just been issued on Komati? I mean, if we were to close down Komati and we're thinking about the people that are there, the RFP should have been issued 6 years before Komati is. Yes. And
Yeah.
then by the time you destroy it, it's a seamless transition into that just energy transition. The RFP comes after Komati has been destroyed. And it says, well, let's see whether this can be just.
But you see, it comes back to my point of human habitat. I don't understand it because I worked on the design of nuclear reactors. When I design it, we take into account 1,000, if not 1,000,000 requirements that all flow into a process. And one of them is for the community, it's for the houses, it's for the jobs, it's for all those things around it. When you move the reactor, you destroy the habitat. They don't want to hear that.
Completely.
Okay, so you're doing habitat destruction, which is what the mining companies did to South Africa 100 years ago on the roads. And when listen to these mine workers, when they hear the energy transition, they're thinking the exact same thing what's going to happen. They are correct. You must be very
Yes.
careful when you touch an energy system. It's not just the volts. They're playing with fire here.
It's not the words. It's a whole philosophy. It's development. It's everything. So I think because there was a dangled 8.5 billion, now the president says it will need a lot more money. Say, but when you signed, you should have talked about a lot more money right at design, if you believed. So you've signed now. The horses have bolted. You've got a Trojan horse.
Well, let's hope he turns around. It seems he's a bit under pressure at the moment. And let's hope that the Minister of Electricity and Energy, I don't even know why we have two nowadays, are speaking with one mind.
Well, I mean, the problem is that one of design thinking. I mean, when you don't have people who can have design thinking in their heads, you don't have them. They cannot make it. I mean, you dangle money before them. They are minds that do not have design thinking, focuses on the money and forgets about everything.
Okay.
So this is where we are. But I think we are in the space where the crisis is deepening. I mean, while I don't nobody wants this Ukraine-Russia crisis, which is really plunging the world into a difficult time. But what is very true is that if this didn't happen, the debates on the just energy transition would have not been heightened to the level they are. And South Africa would have sheepishly fallen into that space. So
well,
now this
we are lucky
crisis,
as well because I see Sweden, the country of Greta Thunberg, has turned around today and said we're not doing wind, we're doing nuclear again. We have seen that
yes,
Siemens, the Germans who made the wind turbines, is going bankrupt, the company. Why? Because fatigue. It's the end of the life cycle of the Energiewende. Now they have to rebuild everything they built. I mean, I cannot understand the logic of a system that deteriorates every 15 years. And my view is the logic of the just energy transition. It's not just, first of all. It's very simple. It's to turn infrastructure into a consumer market. They want short-term profits on infrastructure, so you can rebuild it every 50 years.
yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how
Now
is that
you are really,
sustainable?
it's not sustainable. You are right in economics there now. I mean, because the markets will always want this kind of thing. That's what they are keen on. And they can shift from one thing to the other and then leave everybody in a latch, say, well, we have changed. We are no longer interested in that. And that's what markets do. They don't sustain anything. And now the Reserve Bank now wants to measure sentiment. And that sentiment is called markets. Whereas basically in the change stance they want to have, they actually have to look at what we would call the energy system. And that's where they must focus on. And if they focus on that energy system as the sentiment, then they will get their monetary policy right. We have added a few things in my head around this. If I was finalizing this before I send it for publishing tomorrow. I don't know whether I'll be able to withdraw it to add this discussion, but I think I like to be
You
an
should
article
have it
for
to
next
next
Sunday.
week. I'll send you the
Yes, yeah.
send you the references for next week if you write another column.
No, that
And I
would be
think we would
fantastic.
take it
That
from
would be
there.
fantastic.
Yeah.
I spoke
All
to
right.
Kevin so that we should start writing articles that make sense and mobilizing the engineers in South Africa, that we have the best potential to build nuclear in South Africa. And this is the time to
Yeah.
invest in nuclear. Because we have
Well,
the people that have
I'll
been...
give you the base. I'll give you the base business case. South Africans, 150 South Africans are building a reactor in Dubai. The first reactor in years to be relatively on time. South Africans. South Korean design, non-aligned, neutral country. So there's no geopolitics involved.
Yeah,
You send the
it's
RFI
just
tomorrow, and you get your own people to build it for you, and you do it very quickly. And you
this is the
retain the
best thing you
skills.
can ever have.
Yes.
And if
So
we want to work on a nation building project, because that is consisting of whites, blacks, and everybody in there, that might just be labeled how we build a nation. And to have all those people there and focused on one thing and saying energy security for South Africa.
Yeah.
It will not be a 20-meter or 200-meter flag that we try to be.
It's not going to be built by an entrepreneur. It's by serious people.
No, these are people who have it's this thing that is there in the Chinese about no fear. No, I mean, they have this short sentence, not sentences, it's short sentences or short constructs as no fear. Know this, know that. And they follow those to the letter. I mean, I was listening to the Chinese who built the bridge that was now having another bridge alongside, but the longest now, modern. And that bridge that was built 2 years ago was built by a third generation bridge builder in China, keeping the same philosophy of no fear.
Yeah. So you think we can at this stage learn more from the Asians than we can from the Americans and the Europeans in terms of development?
We have to really move towards the East. They learned a lot from us, I think. The way they followed their rail construction and everything, they seem to have followed in the footsteps of South Africa. I mean, the first rail in 1867 in Durban, which was 3 kilometers, or was it 6 kilometers from the point? When that was constructed, there was nothing in Korea, and I'm sure nothing in China. Now, these guys are having trains that are running at 500 kilometers per hour. So where are we? We don't have any rail to run trains on.
Well,
it's just been physically uprooted, just like that. I mean, this is just...
I think for a way forward, the path to propose, and I don't think it's difficult to sell intellectually, it's very simple. We give the state utilities, the critical ones we keep. There's a lot of them I think you can get rid of. I don't know what half of them does.
SAA you can get rid of.
Yeah.
But keep the flag on that and say you will charge you a certain fee for the flag so that we have this national pride, but otherwise let it go.
Yes, and then equip the utilities with the best people and the best money and the good money to recover it, and let them do the judgment. Because what I've learned working at Electricité de France and at even talking to people at EDF and things, the French allow the engineers to come with the plan. They trust them. And they
Yes.
allow them to come with the tariffs, and they are well aware of the social economic. They discuss the parliament, but it's ultimately EDF that comes with a plan to parliament, and parliament approves it on the best judgment of the engineers. Because the French engineers are, you see, civil engineers traditionally were military civil. The French engineers still have the old military tradition where they go train at the École Polytechnique, and they are the ones managing the French state. They're very similar to China in many ways.
China.
Yeah. And they think of the survival of the state in their judgment, which is, I think, what we need to equip the engineers with.
Longevity of the state, yes.
Yes, that's important.
In the end,
So
it comes to that. I mean, it's the same as Egypt, in Egypt. And I think where the military actually run Egypt, they have Mubarak in prison, but he's replaced by a range of military people. And they construct roads, these military people, and everything. I mean, in Egypt, it's an amazing kind of.
But okay, Sisi also suspended the law and got rid of all the NGOs. He locked them up.
Yeah.
Maybe not what we should do, but we
Yes,
should do it democratically. But it shows the right solution.
The solution is there without the excesses. I mean, we don't have to have those excesses of CC, but the precision that emerges out of military execution, it's what is lacking. It's a lot of noise. Yeah. My article actually is saying, well, if science doesn't lead, then the state perishes. We get led by ignorant people, and the state perishes. So there is a Wara state.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you very much for this conversation. I think we're going to do it again maybe in a few weeks or so. And I think it's important for people to speak to each other and generate this narrative so we can come with an approach for developing the country and the continent. So I think anyone that's invested in South Africa or Africa wants it to develop,
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate this.
No, thanks a lot. I mean, this is a good discussion. Let's continue on it.
Thank you.
And